Hi, and welcome to week 3 of your Troy University course, Literature After 1865. What I'd like to do is kind of take you through what we're going to be doing for this week, and then of course we'll go through and we'll review the observations that you made from week 2. Week 3 is going to be focused on naturalism and of course building a bit more on African American literature. We'll be reading Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper. We'll also be reading her essay on why she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, and we'll be reading a longer piece, which is by Stephen Crane, called The Open Boat. We will also be continuing our African American literature with Washington's Up From Slavery and W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of Black Folk, and it's a selection from both of those. Now, if you go into the assignments area and you select week 3, you will see under that folder that there's an overview and there's also an attachment for additional podcasts. I know that a couple of you had some questions about that. In light of our discussion boards, I would like to kind of go through a couple things that I think are very important to kind of pay attention to, especially as we kind of continue to build on our knowledge and, of course, our exploration of literature in this course. First, I saw that most of you really were starting to get how you want to structure your discussion postings and your responses. You will also see this week I've used your rubric so that you can kind of see if you're proficient, which means you hit all the high points, if it's competent, which means it's hitting most of them, or if it's novice or if it's missing. Some of you are right on the edge of being in that competent, proficient area for both your postings and your responses, so you're going to want to continue to think about how can I develop my evidence, how can I show my analysis through a reasoned response to both the questions and observations and, of course, to your peers. Some of you were missing your responses, and I'm okay with you going back in and posting them. Just go ahead and make sure that you post an email to me after you respond to your peer, and I will reevaluate it. To begin with, Mark did post, and many of you did remark on Chestnuts, The Passing of Grandison. Most of you really did enjoy the storyline, and you saw that it was something that you could actually kind of get behind. I did not hear many of you saying that you did not enjoy it. You know, he really did deal with paradoxes. He was, of course, a black writer of mixed race, but he did narrate his black experience in a context that kind of straddled that line, and I think it does make for a very readerly or an engaging tale of realism. Christopher M. also had a really good interpretation of Henry James, so I encourage you to take a look at that. I like that he focused, as some of you also focused on the idea that what Henry James was saying in his essay was that realism removes the border of what defines a novel. Charlene she spoke in reference to Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetry, and she was surprised by the ease that she felt when she was engaging it. And I think that's one of the tenets of realism, is that it is an easy type of poetry or a type of fiction to kind of get into because it is based, or at least focused, in the real. Ansley mentioned, you know, I got a really good quote from Lathrop, who is one of our, I guess you'd say, essayist and also contemporary observational reader of literature. The idea that realism reveals. And I think that that is also another tenet, is that realism, while it's capturing what's happening, it's also revealing or showing or pointing to a hidden truth, a morality of sorts. Ashland had another great use of the quote, "The glimpse made a picture." And also he mentioned, as some of you also mentioned, that reading aloud, especially the poetry, really did help you to kind of get a sense of what was going on. Kevin mentioned that it was very enjoyable to kind of get an African American perspective on some of the historical events that were occurring at that time, and I think that's also another tenet that is large, rises large in African American realism and also in realism in general. Megan mentioned, in reference to Chestnuts, The Passing, that this was a piece of realism that attempted to, or at least show the downfalls in romanticism or romantic meanderings. Joseph mentioned that Dunbar's poem captured this pain, and in that capturing of the pain, it created a connection with the reader, this sense of empathy in many ways. Jason also pointed out in relation to Dunbar that there was a sense of seeing freedom but not being able to touch it, this kind of almost palpable feeling that one transition from the words on the page to within themselves as the reader. Sarah mentioned some great observations of James. In particular, I really like that she focused on the idea that the deepest quality of literature is also referencing or a referent of the quality of the producer. So it really isn't just about taking a picture. It really is about the person behind that camera, i.e. the author who's crafting these pictures on the page. Ryan, of course, had a great question with the what the hell is wrong with Grandison, which is a great observation. You know, question and inquiry is a key point to reading literature. Always asking yourself, why is this happening, or what does this mean, is a great way to enter literature and to really think about how you want to tussle with some of these ideas. Also in Ryan's posting had some great summarization and application of Henry James with his two main points or two main ideas. Charles had a great reading of James, and he really struck on the idea that it isn't just capturing that image or capturing that realistic moment, but it really is about the idea of imagination, the power of the person behind it. Sherry had a great observation with her statement that what is on the surface is not always true. Once again, you know, this kind of realism reveals, that Lathrop quote that was pulled in here. From, who pulled this one in? Lathrop Ansley's reading of that too. John mentioned that there was a great use of the elevation quote to frame your observations. Yes, just because it is realistic doesn't mean it lacks irony or subterfuge, and that is key. Just because something happens to be in the realistic venue does not mean that it's not dealing with symbolism or irony or subterfuge or questioning of the authorial positioning or narrative authority. It just means that it's focused on this kind of true to life or using a basis of reality for its structure. Christopher mentioned that he took more time and it made him feel it better, or kind of really get that literature. And remember that reading isn't just about getting through the words on the page. It often is about rereading. All good reading is rereading. And that's actually a quote from Vladimir Nabokov. You know, there isn't one text you can just access once. You have to continually do it. Jordan mentioned that the novelist story is just a bunch of text written down, that it's not. That it's not just words on a page, that it really has to have some kind of intent to have the content that matters. And that kind of connects back to Henry James. Jeremy had a great call out on the idea of the dialect in the African American stories, capturing the cultural and the socioeconomic ties of that time. And I think that is something we can see even in our contemporary culture when we speak about certain dialects or certain ways of communicating. Lindsay mentioned the idea of Stephen King's On Writing, this idea that Henry James was writing a very didactic text about instructing one on how to write. Roderick mentioned the idea that James really wanted to point out that good writers are always seeking new experiences, that you can't get stale. Jessica had some great observations and a great connection between Grandison and James. The idea of the art of realism, experiencing life, will outweigh the creative mindset, that it is about living and being out in the world. Edmund's post was absolutely phenomenal. I loved the focus of the orality of the tales, and remembering that most African American literature, up until about the Civil War, post-Civil War, was an oral tradition. It was very much spoken. It was not a novelistic or a kind of a written tradition. It was very oral, much like the Anglo-Saxon too. So I think that's an important call out, and I appreciate Edmund for doing that. Russell mentioned in reference to James the importance of the opinion of the reader, that the reader too is involved in this relationship, and just like we mentioned with M.H. Abrams, the idea of the reader, the author, the context or culture around it, and of course the work, that there is this relationship between these four elements to create a meaning. Also, I just want to call out Corey B's had a great response to Russell's posting, and I think that's a good model if you want to take a look at that. Philip, the idea that he pointed out that James said a novel is a living thing. These are not dead. These are not dead words on a page. These really do live, and as we engage them, they become off the page, and they become in this forever existed, forever, always already moment. Forrest mentioned some great connections between African American and realism in general, which I really do appreciate. And then, of course, we had Chandra, who really focused on James' idea that you have to be in tune with reality. Carrie mentioned a nice call out on Dick's from the story, Deed, that it wasn't about kindness, but it was about impressing and getting this girl Charity. You know, that idea that the moral impulse was not what it seemed, and that kind of pulls out that idea that irony and subterfuge can exist in realism. Quenisha mentioned this idea of the focus on the passing of grandson, and I think that was good. I understand using attachments, Quenisha, but I would really appreciate it if you put it into the body of the text. It can kind of be, I find that a lot of students don't open the attachments, and I would hate to see you not get the benefit of having responses to your observations. So if you can please try just to cut and paste it into the body, that'll be perfect. Vance mentioned in reference to Paul Dunbar that he could feel and see and really experience the realism in When My Lady Sings. And I think that poem, above and beyond anything, needs to be read aloud, needs to be listened to. You can find any number of YouTube clips and audio clips where you can kind of hear it, and it really does resonate. Jennifer mentioned she had a really good reading of the poetry also with Dunbar. She mentions that realism supports deterministic philosophy rather than focusing on the lower class. And I think that's important. It's not a critique or a condemnation of class issues or race issues. It really is about this idea of one's existence being determined by outside forces or even internal forces. And I think that that is a good idea to kind of keep in mind as you're reading realism. Jason mentioned some really good points of observations on Chestnut's story, and as I mentioned, I think a lot of you really did enjoy reading that text. Melvin pointed out that James suggests that being able to follow good and bad is the key, and that gray doesn't really imply a lot of power in realism. And it truly doesn't. I mean, there is some, I guess you'd say, there is some gray, but most of it is a very black and white kind of situation. Emily mentioned had a good summary. I would like to see a bit more connection to some of the observations in our discussion posting. Maybe taking a definition or an observation and using that to guide your reading would be good too. Camelia mentioned the importance of life and learning experience to bring novel to life, once again iterating what Henry James was telling us. Juan mentioned the idea of the telling and retelling of freedom in Chestnut's Day was a central tenet of the story, and many of you did speak of freedom in many different ways, freedom from and freedom to. And Jonathan finished it up with the idea that Dunbar, the reading it out loud really allowed him to hear and to see it, and most importantly, to feel it. And I think that that is an important component of what we're doing, is that these are not static and denied pages. Instead, they really are about getting it off the page. I look forward to seeing what you guys do with week 3. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns.